Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for having us here anyway, more generally. Just before starting, I'll give you a brief overview of what the plan is for these 3 weeks. So we'll have 3 times 3 lectures. We looked at what Sylvie and Karen and others, Liam and others teach here, and we decided to try and teach something that's not already taught to some extent. So we are going to try to cover one thing that's really a growth area as we see it in the field, which is starting to think about forms and about how the imperfect markets in allocating resources to forms leads to macro consequences. So the first week today, I'm going to be talking about credit and microcredit. So 2 lectures on credit, thinking about a very simple theoretical framework for what might be the main issue in credit markets. Then a lot of evidence on credit markets, on returns to capital for small firms, non-firms, and larger firms. And then the last lecture of this week will be about microcredit, actually. Then then they will 1 week off. The following week after that will be about firms. So we'll be talking about a very recent and really evolving rapidly literature on firms in developing countries. So issues of contracts, issues of exports, issues, a series of issues about firms, that's except for credit, which would have been covered in those 3 weeks. And then that will sort of set the stage to think about macro implication of imperfect markets, which Abhijit will do. So I will now give him my microphone and let him explain a little bit how that will play out.
I guess the only thing to be worth saying is that I think once you go from the micro to the macro, I think one needs models. So what we'll try to do then is bringing some models. So you can't do this exercise without making a bunch more assumptions, but then what you learn from that is, questions like, suppose we find that there are particular imperfections that are affecting particular firms. Does that add up to anything? Does it matter? In the end, what we care about is whether that extends beyond the individual firm, because imagine that one firm is too small, but maybe that means another firm is too large, and that's okay, that's fine, they cancel out. So when does the fact that there are distortions add up to something more than a distortion at the firm level? So that's the question, and for that we're going to develop a little bit more formal apparatus for thinking about those and why that would happen, and when would that really matter, questions like that. So I don't know whether that helps, but in any case, that's sort of the plan. Okay, so I will now go, and I'll see you back in 3 weeks. Or I'll see all of you probably before.
No, I don't know if I can do this again. So, all right, so let's start with credit. So we're going to start by putting the most basic model of the credit market possible. Then we are going to quickly, I'm going to present some stylized facts on credit in developing countries, credit markets in developing countries that are going to make it abundantly clear that that very basic model is not working out, which you already all know. But it's useful to understand in what way exactly it's not working out. Then I'm going to go over very briefly 2 classical alternative models. Moral hazard and adverse selection. I'm going to go very quickly through those because this is the ones you have seen, and they are not really helping squaring the facts anyways, so we're going to abandon them quickly. And I'm going to be spending some more time on another model, which is a monitoring model, which is different from either and seem to have a little bit more empirical bite. Once we have done that, I'm going to start looking a little bit about returns to capital for people that are mainly operating in the informal credit markets. There is a recent literature trying to do that, and we're going to spend some time on that. And that's going to be the end for today, I'm assuming. If not, we can continue. Once we have finished that, we are going to have said a lot of things about people who are mainly operating in informal credit markets, which is a large segment of the economy, so that's interesting. But one could wonder whether that large segment of the economy has that much import on aggregate quantities, because these are many, many firms, but also very, very small firms. So it is worth thinking about the more formal segment of the economy, which is mainly dealing with banks. And because we are going to start on a monitoring model, it's going to be useful to think about banks as an intermediary. In addition from the standard problems that a single-man moneylender operation might have, banks are organizations which by their nature tend to be very large and tend to have relatively poorly paid people handling large amount of monies. And therefore, this creates additional incentive problems, which might be much bigger than the incentive problem we tend to focus on, which is between the borrower and the moneylender. So I'm going to be spending some time thinking about banks, first as organizations, putting down a model, some evidence for that, and then a slight digression, but pretty important. Many banks are actually public sector banks. So to these problems that banks are large organizations which would have incentive issues just by this very nature, you add political economic consideration to that. We're spending some time mainly on evidence on that. That's going to leave us to the point where we are going to say, well, banks are not that good at allocating monies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that bank clients are credit constrained, because it could be that they are getting as much as they can from the bank, and then the rest they are getting in the informal market or to trade credit or something like that. And because they're large and because they have a bank behind them, it is possible that despite the fact that the bank is not giving them all of the monies that they need, it is fairly easy to get all of the monies that they need from the rest of the markets. So we're going to spend some time thinking about larger firms, bank clients are credit constrained or not, which doesn't follow from the fact that banks might be very inefficient. And conclude that in fact they still do, that even larger firms are credit constrained. That's going to be a very important piece for thinking about aggregate consequences of that. So that's going to be sort of lecture 2, if my timing is roughly correct. And then we'll go to think about microfinance. In the context of thinking about microfinance, I'm going to introduce some new, more methodological tools, thinking about Bayesian hierarchical modeling to aggregate results from different experiments, and thinking about some machine learning to think about heterogeneity of returns to capital. So that's for advertising, for a little bit of methods, empirical methods in lecture 3. Not so much until then. So let's start with our very basic model, neoclassical model of the capital market. Everyone faces the same interest rate, adjusted for risk being that you might default. So there is some risk of default, which is exogenous, say your project failed, so you cannot reimburse. So the gross interest rate, I'm going to use, in general in this entire lecture, I'm working with the gross interest rate. Even though I'm writing it little r, think of it as the gross interest rate, which is, if I lend you 1, you have to give me back r, not 1 plus r, okay? So the gross interest rate is r, and then this is adjusted by the risk of default, which is given by the sky. So then I can pay to the depositor 1 minus d times r, minus small change for operating a bank, salaries and stuff. And immediate consequences of that is that everybody should have the same marginal returns to capital, which would be 1 minus D times R. So that's a nice model. It's very, very convenient. It's very, very powerful, as you will see when Abhijit teaches aggregative theory, because it means that even though people might operate very, very different technologies, they are going to operate it to the scale where they all have the same marginal rate of return. That means that we can consider that the economy is one big giant machine. So that's kind of the foundation for using aggregate production function, even though we perfectly know that in reality that's not, everybody has a different production function. Unfortunately, this is a model that doesn't fit reality whatsoever. In various ways that it's worth listing once. Then in the slides, there is lots and lots of examples for each of these things. I'm not going to go over all of the examples in details, but you will find them either in the slides or they are really in our chapter on the Handbook of Economic Growth. We have spent some time lovingly discussing them. They are all a little bit dated in terms of the references, but not actually in terms of what they say. I don't think things have changed all that much. But anyway, what are the facts that I want you to keep in mind for thinking about how the informal credit market might operate? So first is that there is a sizable gap between lending rates and deposit rates within the same sub-economy. What do I mean by same sub-economy? Literally the same city. So in the same city, you might find, and in fact, the same people, the same, financial intermediary, which could be an informal money lender or a somewhat more formal financiers, might offer deposit rates that are 5% or 9%, and lending rates which are 78%, 90%, 25%. So there is a big gap between the two. So that's not consistent with the idea that the difference between the lending rate and the borrowing rate should be just a factor of 1 minus 2, unless the default rate is super high. So that leads us to the next fact, actually not the next fact, the fact number 3, which is, are the default rate very high? And another feature of this market is that the default rates are very low. So I'm not talking about default rate to banks, which tend to be quite high, but default rate to informal lenders are very low. So we often insist on default rate to microfinance organizations, which are very low, and that is true, but that's not just them. In the surveys of informal markets, you also see that default rates are very, very low. By the way, one study that is worth, if you have to read one study on the informal credit market, the Alim study on a few lenders and money lenders in Pakistan is a useful, it sort of has all these things in just one setting. Incidentally, you should stop me. You should interrupt me with questions. I might also ask you questions sometimes, but I might also forget, so you just feel free to interrupt me at any point. So so are the rates of default high? In fact, no, they are not high. The rate of default tend to be low. In a LIM study, for example, the rate of default tend to be about 2% on average of the capital lent is at risk for some reason. Another thing which I said along the way when I said in the same economy you could have deposit rate of 5% and lending rate of 25%, 78%, 90%. I did already stated the second fact, which is the interest rate are extremely variable. So in one sub-economy and even one sector, you might find people facing, say, a fruit seller in Chennai that is borrowing on a daily market might face an interest rate of 5% a day. 5% a day, if you try to combine what it is, it's really a lot. And at the same time, still in Chennai, a larger fruit seller who is actually working in a little shop, instead of having a cart that they borrow daily from, might face an interest rate of say 30% a year. There are other examples in the slide, but if you think like 5% a day to 30% a year is just a very wide variation in the interest rate. And again, because the rate of default, so you could say, well, maybe there are some categories of people who have who are more risky than others, and that's known. Say the guys who have this little cards, they could be at any point in time, something could, they could meet with an auto accident and they would lose all of their material for all of their stock for the day. So they are much more risky than the regular, than someone who has a shop. So that's normal. But that's again, so this is the difference in interest rates is explained by the fact that the exogenous rates of default are actually very different from people to people. And again, that's just not true, because the default rates are low across the board. So that doesn't seem that it's the explanation. So that's the third fact. Another fact, which is maybe a little bit more subtle, is that there seems to be a lot of ex-ante competition in the market for credit. So what do I mean by that? So in a lot of, even now, in the traditional sort of rhetorics, thinking about money lenders, you have the idea that the reason that money lenders are sharks, loan sharks, in fact, microfinance sort of defined itself against these guys as being like, we are the anti-sharks, and the fight against microfinance is to, again, compare them to sharks, etc. So this idea that the money lender is actually just extracting a huge amount of surplus, which would be possible if they were the only people in the area who would be able to lend money. But so the Alim study is pretty much single-mindedly focused on that point, which is to say, A, there are a lot of lenders in a given village. So it doesn't seem that the high rates are a function of the fact that you have no opportunity, at least ex ante. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no monopoly power ex post. In the adverse selection model that we're going to see in a minute, even if we are not going to spend a lot of time on, you would have a monopoly power ex post, because why would you lose your money lender to go to another one, except that you have had a problem with them? So anybody who leaves a money lender would be suspect of having had a problem with the initial money lender, and therefore would be considered to be potentially a bad risk by the same person, by the next lenders, which would drive up the interest rate that they would face. Anticipating that, people might be very reluctant to leave their current money lender, which would create some monopoly power ex ante, corresponding to the fact that it's costly to lose the person. So I'm going to go back to that idea after we've spent some time on monitoring costs. But the point is that if there are a lot of people in the market,
Yes, I have a question. When you say that there are low levels of default, it's because we're excluding the fact that some people, they can, for example, they borrow money, and then afterwards to pay that debt, they can borrow money from another money lender, or how does it work? Because in that case, the default of the debt is motivated by the fact that they are borrowing money of someone else.
Yeah, if they did that eventually, so two things. Number one, that means that even if people manage to do that, from the point of view of money lender number one, the money is back, so the interest rate still doesn't have to be huge in order to justify, for him to break even. Okay, so that's still, it means if just mechanically the default rate, even if this is due to this rolling over, mechanically the default rate would not explain would not be the source of the high interest rate. This is not coming from the y minus d in the neoclassical model. The second thing is that if people were rolling over in a way that were unsustainable, eventually you would have a default somewhere. So we would find it. Now, it's possible that people are rolling over till they hit a public sector bank and then default on them. But that's a lot of people are shut off from the public sector bank, so that doesn't seem the case. So it would seem that even if people are rolling over, in steady state, we should see the default appearing somewhere. So that doesn't seem to be empirically consistent with what we're seeing.
The informal credit takes place in currency or in private monies? I mean, what is the leverage for lenders?
What do you mean by currency versus private monies?
I mean, is it cash or is it bills of exchange?
So it depends. So trade credit is usually it could be a thing. So credit between firms can be in the form of trade credit. So for example, people who are selling the clothes merchants are often also lenders to the people who are manufacturing the clothes, and they are lending in the form of goods. Money lender that you see in villages could be lending cash. Would be often lending cash. So I think you have a combination of the two depending on whether they are lending input or whether it is in the form of trade credit, in which case it will be in the form of an input that is paid after the fact, which is for example, these are for larger firms that we look at. The trade credit is about 60% of the entire credit that they are getting. The rest being bank credit, actually. That's related to this, somewhat related to this point, which is that informal credit is often for production, not just consumption. So one way in which, so what it means, and the way that this is important, is that what it means is that if people are willing to pay this very high interest rate, it must suggest that they have production opportunity that justifies this very high interest rate, as long as it's production credit. If it was just consumption credit, then you could say, well, of course, if they are about to starve, then they are willing to pay very high interest rate. It's a marginal utility of consumption that is very high now. So it tells me nothing about the marginal productivity of this investment. But although part of the informal credit is for consumption, in particular emergency consumption that would justify this very high interest rate, a lot of the informal credit takes place in the form of trade credit or in the form of financial credit for production. Which means, and again, that's something that you want to keep in your head for some time. And for a while, that's really the only evidence we had of that fact, that the marginal return of production must be, the marginal return of capital must be pretty high. So it doesn't interact, because if I'm willing to borrow at 78% for production, and I'm not defaulting on the loan, it must be that I've used the money such that I got a 78% marginal product of capital. So for a while, until relatively recently, the literature that I'm going to describe a little bit later today, this was actually the one evidence we had, or several pieces of evidence, but all quite indirect, to say that poor people must have some poor people must have very large marginal product of capital, because otherwise why would they paying this very high interest rate and reimburse anyways? So that gives us another interesting fact. Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know how it is possible to have interest rate of 5% a day in a decentralized world. It strictly makes no sense to reimburse such high interest rate.
Yeah.
So if this is reimbursed or refunded, I mean, why is it because people must provide collateral, but it doesn't really make sense for people? Is it because there is X cost monopoly power, that is, once you consider a bank or a microfinance organization, it's not possible to find money anywhere, or anyone else? Are there other explanation for this very positive?
Yes, so that leads to this point. I'm going to spend about 1 minute on a moral hazard model, but I don't think we are in a moral hazard world. It's exactly true. We are in a world for a lot of these people where the ability to enforce your repayment is actually quite high. So the ability to enforce, once you pay a cost, once the lender pays a cost, for example, hiring a thug to break your leg if you don't send the money, then the ability to get the money back is quite high. So that's a very good point and very important point, which is why I'm going to spend much more time on the monitoring model than on the moral hazard model. By the way, the 5% a day are not interest rates that are charged either by microfinance organization or by banks. The 5% a day are rates that are charged by the fruit sellers, actually. Basically, what they do is they give them the fruit, and then at the end of the day, they give back the fruit or the cart, or both. So I think you are right about the possible monopoly power ex post, which is have one relationship with this person. There might be collusion with the other ones. And I think I am right about the ability to enforce. So these are the kind of summaries of these facts with more specific examples, but I think we went through a lot of them. Some are old, some are more recent, and I just wanted to have them here. Oh, sorry, I forgot fact 6, which is pretty important. Lenders favor the rich in 2 ways. Rich people are more likely to get a loan at all, and rich people tend to pay lower interest rate. Well, and a third fact, rich people tend to have larger loans. So rich people are more likely to have a loan. Richer people, less poor people, are more likely to have a loan. They get bigger loan once they get one, and their interest rate on the loan is lower. So how much you're paying, how much interest you're paying depends on how much you're borrowing. The correlation is negative. So we also need to keep that fact in line. For example, someone who is landless on this survey of informal credit market in India, landless laborer paid rates ranging from 28 to 125 a year, and people with land pay interest rate ranging from 21 to 40. Yeah.
And yet the default rate is the same across levels? And
the default rate is the same. Yep. So those are the facts that you should keep in some, that we are going to try to juggle with and think about what are the type of models that might work. So now let's quickly dispose of 2 that have some relevance, but I don't want to spend too much time on because I don't think they work in our context. So the first one is moral hazard. And so the basic idea of any moral hazard model is that since you repay, so there is a choice of project. You could choose a project that is very risky, that has some chance of failing and sometimes chance of succeeding, but if you succeed, you're doing very well. Because you repay only if you have money to repay, in this world of limited liability, you will always pick the risky project. If things pan out, you get the return and you repay the fixed interest rate. If things don't pan out, you don't repay. So the bank, anticipating that, will charge a higher interest rate for when it can get it, which will lead to a high interest rate, much higher than without moral hazard in equilibrium. Or they might lead to no lending because there is a ratcheting effect, which is if the interest rate is higher, the incentive to choose a risky project is even higher, so default might be even higher in equilibrium, and therefore it could be that there is just no equilibrium there. So there might be no lending whatsoever. So some people might be shut off. Some people, depending on the riskiness of the project at the disposal, might be completely shut off from credit. and the one who get credit will pay a higher rate. The reason why this model is not going to work is that there is going to be a lot of default in equilibrium. And we don't see default in equilibrium, so that's the simplest model of that class. We might play with it to make it more, to make it a better model. But at the end of the day, that's going to be the limitation. We don't want a model where there is a lot of default in equilibrium. Another possibility is an adverse selection model, where this time there are some people who are more risky than others, and it's private information, so I don't know. The bank doesn't know. It can only offer a fixed interest. The bank or the lender can offer a fixed interest rate and cannot screen. So the only people who are going to take the loan are people who know that often enough they won't need to reimburse because they have this risky project. So again, anticipating that, the interest rate will be higher. And the banks will need to try and do stuff to screen the customer ex ante. If they manage to do that, they might offer different interest rate to different people. There might also be a breakdown in lending altogether for some category of people. But again, you're going to see a lot of default in equilibrium. So that's so neither of these model is going to give us the combination of very high interest rate or very large gap between the interest rate and the cost of capital, very big wedges, and low default rate, and the variability, and the fact that despite the fact that the default rate is the same, you pay lower interest rate and you get larger loan if you're rich. So one model that might do that is one that focuses on monitoring, and precisely the type of things that you have to do to avoid default. So where the default is not due to the choice of project, but is due to your possibility to just run away with the money. Now you could take that model and then combine them and mix and match with the moral hazard model, for example, and that would work too. I'm going to focus on just the very simplest decision, which is you have the money and you still try to run away with it, okay? So suppose that you abstract from project choice, you abstract from project failing, all projects succeed. So the issue is to prevent the borrower who has the money to anyway run away with it. So suppose that you invest K dollars, you get a gross return F of K, and the gross interest rate is R, as before. And a borrower who has wealth of W and invests K will need to borrow K minus W, and then he has to repay K minus W times R. Now instead, you can say that you could run away by paying a cost eta, which is proportional to actually to the amount invested. I wrote borrowed here, but it's invested. All the math is done with invested. It makes the math easier. So you have the choice between. So at the end of the day, once your investment is done, you could the borrower. This is the incentive contability constraint for the borrower. He could say, well, I'm going to take the return of the project minus what I have to reimburse to the bank, or I'm going to take the return to the project minus what would I have to pay to run away with the money. And this is, you see that it's proportional to the amount that's invested. So we get rid of this and rearrange, and you get that K over W is R over R minus eta, so which is some function of the interest rate and the cost of running away with the money. So this lambda tells you that richer people will be able to borrow more. How much is there is this multiplier over how much money you're able to put into the project. So you could think of that to some extent as collateral, but it's collateral to the extent that if you're trying to run away, you're destroying part of it. That's why it's kind of important that it's étaqué. You're destroying part of it. So people who have more money will be able to borrow more because they have more at stake. And people who have, and how much more that lambda, which is going to be some measure of efficiency of the credit market, is going to depend on how costly it is to run away. That maybe depends on whether there are tribunals and policemen and stuff like that, and then on the interest rate as well. So the higher the interest rate, the more likely you are going to try and run with the money. But that doesn't really work. So at least it tells us one thing, which is the poor people will be able to borrow less. That's useful in a lot of models. But it still doesn't do what we would like it to do, because the interest rates are still going to be low. Because in equilibrium, you're never going to, as a bank, you're never going to lend more to the person than what satisfies the incentive compatibility constraint. So nobody defaults, so the interest rate can be the cost of capital. So we are not home yet. We want to add monitoring, and the idea is that if the lender just sits on its hands waiting for the borrower to repay, the cost of running away is zero. So lender has to do something. Put some of their friends on the case or something like that. So suppose that there is some cost for monitoring that the lender has to pay. So what is the nature of this cost of monitoring? So it could be that, in doing some research on the person who is borrowing, it could be making sure that you keep your, going back to our friends, the food seller, making sure that you hang out on the markets, you know who they are borrowing from, you know where their kids go to school, you know a certain number of things that might turn out to be relevant at the time. You seem to be skeptical that people are using thugs, but even banks are using thugs sometimes, like to to recover. The people who are Citibank in India got into a large amount of trouble a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, because they were using thugs to recover car loans that they had given to people. Yeah.
Wouldn't rich borrower be able to also have thugs?
The rich borrower, would they hire to have thugs in exchange? Yes. Yeah, that would cost them some ETA. So that's that. Maybe we can fold that in, but maybe not. It might be a point where the borrower is more powerful than the bank, than the lender. I don't know if we see that, in which case the lender might just try and stay away from them. I don't know if we see that but then in informal markets, certainly in formal markets, we're going to talk about banks. There are cases where, some of the some of the biggest defaulters, for example, against banks in India today, are the biggest industrialists who clearly have the money in other places, but are telling, are in a position of telling the government, nice little government you have here, would it be sad if something happened to it? So, so although that's not covered here, it could. That's the thing. That's a good point. But let's ignore that for the moment. One thing that is worth pointing out is that a part of this monitoring cost, at least part of this monitoring cost, is likely to be fixed. So for example, when someone comes to you with a project, if it's a mini project or a larger project, you still have to go and kind of inspect the project. If you need to recover, you're going to need to, and with the caveat that you pointed out that they might hire their own bodyguard, you're going to need to look for the person, whatever the size of the project, that's going to cost you some money. And these monitoring costs are high. So Alim in the Pakistan study calculates them to be 50 cents per dollar lent on average, which could, which is much higher than the probability of default times the loan, given the low default that we talked about. So these are not small changes. These are actually a significant amount of money. So let's think about them. So first, we could think about making them proportional to the amount lent. And if they were proportional to the amount borrowed, then and assume that since we had used this fact in the figure that there are many lenders, so there is a no profit condition. The lenders are not making money in equilibrium. Then the interest rate must be equal to the cost of capital plus the cost of monitoring. If we simplify here, that means that the interest rate has to be equal to the cost of capital plus this phi, this proportional cost. So the interest rate will only vary to the extent that the cost of capital vary or the cost or this proportional cost of monitoring vary. So we are not going to get variation in interest rate for people with different wealth. The people with different wealth will borrow more, but they'll borrow more at the same rate as the poorer people. We are not going to get, within the same market, if the monitoring cost is the same, then everybody should face the same interest rate. But that's unlikely, so that wouldn't quite cut it, but that's also unlikely to be quite right. It is almost surely the case that part of the monitoring cost is a fixed cost. I'm going to ignore the proportional cost for now to see how far the fixed cost gets us. So suppose that unlike this situation that I just described, the monitoring cost is entirely fixed. So that's clearly an exaggeration. In reality, there is some amount of, you're going to spend more effort on a large loan than on a smaller loan, but suppose, to simplify for the moment, that it's entirely fixed. Then the lender zero profit condition is R times K minus W equal rho times K minus W, so that's the cost of funds for them, what is paid to depositors, plus this fixed cost for any loan that is being given. Suppose that the compatibility constraint binds, so people do not default in equilibrium. As we had the same thing as before, they are not defaulting, so the interest rate must be equal to the cost of the gross interest rate on to be reimbursed. The gross interest to be reimbursed on the cost that is borrowed must be exactly equal to the cost that you would incur if you instead try to run away with the money. So that's the no profit condition, that's the incentive compatibility constraint. I can combine them and I get this expression for the gross, that relates the amount that is being paid to depositor plus the fixed cost must be equal to the cost of running away with the money in the case of monitoring. So that now we can easily combine these two to get K. And we get K must be equal to rho times W minus phi divided by rho minus eta. And then what happens is if rho times W minus phi is negative. First of all, is it possible that rho times W minus phi is negative? It could be. If you're not very rich, it wouldn't take much of a monitoring cost to make that negative. So in that case, you're not going to be able to borrow at all. So some people are going to be shut down for that reason, which of course will be the poor people, because they have a lower W, will tend to be shut down for that reason. And then the second thing that might, and then once we have that, we can now calculate what the interest rate should be. So how do we do that? We can go back to this expression R times K minus W equal rho times K minus W plus phi, which you can rewrite as R equals rho plus phi divided by K minus W. And then you have an expression for K here, which allows you to write down this expression with one line of algebra. And now we get the interest rate. The interest rate is going to be the cost of fund plus that term. So second thing here, what happens if AW is smaller than phi, equal or smaller than phi? Again, there is no lending possible because the interest rate would be infinite. I mean, as long as it hits 0, it would be infinite. Anything else? So this would not. So they wouldn't. For anyone who has wealth such that AW is eta W, sorry, is lower than phi, there is no lending possible. As long as eta W is larger than phi, then lending is possible. But you can see that now the interest rate has this. Has many interesting features for us. First of all, it's going to be increasing in, decreasing how much wealth you have. You can see the intuition for that result, where it's coming from. It's because people who have more wealth can borrow more, so the monitoring cost is spread over a larger amount of money. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this multiplier property, which is that even a small increase in the monitoring cost lead to a large increase in, so even a small increase in cost of fund leads to a large increase in the interest rate. Why is that the case? So that you can see it in the math, that you have rho here, but you also have it here. And it's multiplied by something which is large and something potentially very large for people who are poor. So the interest rate will grow more than proportionally with the cost of fund. And the reason, again, is related to the incentive, which is when the cost of fund becomes bigger, there is more to reimburse if you were going to reimburse. And therefore, your willingness to live instead of reimbursing with the money is high. So it means that the interest rate is going to be sensitive to W, and it's going to be sensitive to the cost of fund. So what are the policy, very sensitive to the cost of fund. So what are the policy implications of this model? Well, what are the implications of this model? First of all, it's doing a pretty good job, not entirely surprisingly perhaps, because it's rigged to give us just that, but it's doing a good job explaining a large wedge between the cost of capital and the interest rate. It's going to the interest. Then it's telling us that the interest rate is very sensitive to the cost of capital and the monitoring cost. When as soon as 1 minus phi is small, it's also going to be very sensitive to eta, the cost of running away with the money for the same reason, which we're seeing here. The interest rate will be especially sensitive to these things when the interest rate is high relative to the cost of capital. So it's going to be more and more, it's increasingly sensitive. In terms of policy implication, what does it mean? It means that we have 3 levers that we can play with, which policy levers which would have a multiplying effect, where we would take advantage of the multiplying property. First is you could subsidize the cost of capital. It's going to have a more than proportional effect through the effect that we are looking at. It could lead to welfare gains, contrary to the classical model, because R will go down more than proportionally, and people will borrow more. Second, reducing monitoring costs. So if you want, that's the answer from the banks, to be a little bit caricatural. That's the public bank answer coming and trying to offer people loans at low interest rate. Reducing monitoring costs can lead to large social gains. That, if you want, is the microfinance answer. Trying to, what does microfinance do, if I was to caricature a little bit? They are trying to reduce the monitoring cost. They're also trying to make villagers bear it. So it's not that the monitoring, it's not that when we say sometimes a criticism of microfinance is that it's not that they are reducing the monitoring costs, it's they pass it on to someone else. Because now it's the villagers who are monitoring each other. But that's an unfair criticism in this case, because in this model it is very good that it's not the same person who is carrying the monitoring cost, because it means the monitoring cost for the lender, that's what enters with the multiplying property. The fact that someone else is paying the monitoring cost is of no consequence from the point of view of this model, doesn't enter in this model. So it's very efficient socially to outsource the subcontracting to someone that is not compensated for it.